In the footage, you can see two Russian T-8 OMS tanks operating and carrying 24 troops, suddenly destroyed when a Ukrainian kamikaze drone hit from behind. The Ukrainian border guard also shared footage showing Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance units using military drones to blow up Russian troops hiding in tree rows. Footage taken in the Bakhmut region shows several Russian soldiers lying on the ground after an effective drone strike by Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian troops also shared footage of Russian soldiers fleeing as Ukrainian troops bombarded the trenches with missiles and airstrikes on Bakhmut. This footage was released by the 10th Mountain Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and shows Russian soldiers carrying their injured comrades and running away. On Monday, Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade also made footage showing its troops storming Russian positions during the fighting near Bakhmut. First-person footage shows Ukrainian troops storming a forest path as explosions erupt around them. Later footage also shows a Ukrainian soldier entering the Russian trenches and dropping several Russian soldiers there. At present, the Ukrainian counterattack against the Russian troops has been very successful. In this case, the Ukrainian troops have fulfilled their main task of slowly paralyzing the Russian defense. To date, the Ukrainian Defense Forces have eliminated more than 246,190 Russian invaders and 490 others in the last 24 hours. Meanwhile, according to Russian media, the Ukrainian armed forces have changed tactics in the second wave of counteroffensives. Russian media said that after the Ukrainian troops succeeded in occupying Staromayorskoye, they did not stop organizing their defense there as usual. Instead, they focused their efforts on clearing the technical hurdles, focusing on the direction of harvest. Russian media also note that recently the aviation activity of the Ukrainian armed forces has increased significantly. There were about 7 raids on this settlement. In addition, Ukrainian electronic warfare is actively working to suppress the communications of the DPR troops, and intensive artillery preparation is underway. All these actions show that the enemy is preparing to storm Urosenoy. If we recall the recent past, having launched the main offensive on Novodonetskoye, the enemy almost took Urosenoy, but the Ukrainian troops were less persistent. After that, the DPR troops strengthened their presence in this village, and for the last few days suppressed attempts to attack directly on Urosenoy. Meanwhile, retired British General Richard Dannett argues that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is now gaining real momentum, increasing the likelihood of decisive moves on the battlefield. The Ukrainian advance east around Bakhmut and south towards Tokmak created uncertainty among the Russian high command about where to deploy its limited reserves, he explained. The new momentum could soon create conditions for exiting the defense zone and into a more open country, which the Ukrainian 10th Corps could take advantage of. The Ukrainian 2nd Echelon troops contained most of the Western-supplied armor, as well as fresh and well-trained troops. However, if the Kyiv troops were able to get behind Russian lines, then the resistance was expected to collapse soon.
Part of their tanks was destroyed by anti-tank missiles and grenades, while Ukrainian forces used drones to burn another portion of their armored vehicles. The Russian troops fled from the battlefield. In this video, you can see at least 9 units of destroyed Russian armored vehicles. In an attempt to dislodge Ukrainian forces from the settlements, all of this also means that Ukrainian forces will soon be able to break through the final line of Russian defense and enter the open operational space, where they can advance much faster. For nearly 2 months, the Ukrainian army has been navigating through Russian minefields, suffering significant losses of armored vehicles. However, in some places, the Ukrainians managed to breach the first line of defense. Recently, the Russian defense has noticeably weakened due to the significant loss in armored vehicles, artillery, and personnel within the Russian army. Additionally, the Russians have also lost a considerable amount of ammunition as the Ukrainians effectively conducted strikes deep into the enemy's rear, destroying numerous ammunition depots. In this video, we can see a Russian tank moving to support the infantry. The tank was spotted and a decision was made to strike it using an FPV drone. Interestingly, after the strike, the tank immediately exploded. Miraculously, one of the crew members survived and managed to escape from the tank. The disabled tank continued to burn for a while until it turned into scrap metal. Later, it was evident that the drone strike caused the tank's ammunition to detonate as the tank's turret was blown up. 2 more Russian armored personnel carriers were moving to reinforce the position, but fell into an ambush. One of them was hit by an anti-tank grenade, but it continued its movement. Then, we see the second grenade missing its target. Eventually, the Russian armored personnel carriers were halted, and their crews fled the battlefield. An interesting video has surfaced on the internet. Near the burnt tank, Russian soldiers held a funeral procession. They placed a wooden cross right next to the tank and prayed for their fallen comrade. Another soldier fired shots into the air, as is customary among military personnel. Judging by the remains of the disabled tank, you can imagine the magnitude of the explosion and what might have happened to the crew inside the tank. Ukrainian artillery also successfully targeted and hit 2 more S-24 self-propelled howitzers. The first Russian mortar was positioned in a visible and elevated location, making it an easy target for the Ukrainian artillery, which successfully hit and disabled it. To give you an understanding, this mortar system is a highly dangerous weapon. It is equipped with a 240mm caliber gun and can launch projectiles up to a range of 10 kilometers, capable of destroying even heavily fortified bunkers. The next 2S4 mortar launcher was spotted as it moved into a firing position. The Ukrainians waited for the mortar to reach its destination and then struck it with a HIMARS missile. As expected, the target was completely destroyed. By the way, the HIMARS rocket systems continue to destroy a lot of Russian equipment every day. 4 armored vehicles were hidden behind the trees, but 1 HIMARS missile destroyed them. However, HIMARS doesn't always hit the target accurately. The Russians are also facing losses in their aviation. In this video, you can witness the destruction of a Russian attack helicopter, the Ka-52 Alligator. One of the crew members in this downed helicopter was Colonel Vitaly Tabaknikov of the Russian aviation. This helicopter is considered the best attack helicopter in Russia, with an estimated cost of around $15 million. According to British intelligence data, the Ukrainian armed forces have successfully shot down more than a quarter of such helicopters. However, the Russian forces still have sufficient resources in the south of Ukraine to repel the counteroffensive. Unwilling to allow the Ukrainians to advance, the Russians are committing all their forces to launch counterattacks. In war, one has to destroy various targets. It is crucial to destroy enemy ammunition depots. Ukraine is very successful in dealing with this. Each destroyed projectile potentially saves a soldier's life. Destroying enemy ammunition means fighting proactively. It's a preemptive move. That's why the Ukrainian command attaches great importance to identifying and destroying enemy ammunition depots. In this video, 2 Grad BM rocket launchers were spotted. The first missile missed its target, but due to the shockwave, the Grad BM started launching its projectile spontaneously. The second missile also missed. Perhaps the Grad rocket launchers were damaged, but they remained intact nonetheless. HIMARS can miss only if incorrect coordinates were provided to it, and such mistakes sometimes happen. But the most Russian armored vehicles are being destroyed by FPV drones. In this video, one of these drones strikes a Russian armored personnel carrier. It was damaged and caught fire. A few minutes passed, and boom! The transporter suddenly exploded and soared into the air. And this is a larger target, the Russian Sanchepek rocket system. I've often told you how dangerous this weapon is. The Russians are using it against the advancing Ukrainian infantry. The operator directed the FPV drone straight into the compartment with rockets, and the rockets began detonating spontaneously. It looked like a massive fiery show. Using FPV drones, Ukrainians conduct full-fledged hunts for Russian tanks. Drones can also be used against infantry in fortified trenches, and even for road clearing from mines. Here's another advantage of conventional drones over other types of weapons. Take a look at this video. They hid a Russian armored transporter behind an industrial building, pressing it tightly to the wall. Ukrainian soldiers are on the other side. In this position, It's impossible to destroy the armored transporter with artillery or an anti-tank missile. However, thanks to a regular drone hovering in the air, we can observe the location of this target, and then a small FPV drone can fly around the corner of the building and strike the armored vehicle. And the cost of such an operation does not exceed $500. As I mentioned in my previous reports, the Russians almost immediately abandon their armored vehicles when facing danger. Ukrainian drone operators are consistently engaged in destroying this abandoned armor if it is located in the gray zone and cannot be captured as a trophy. The Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance spotted a Russian T-80 tank. A precise artillery shot was fired directly at the rear of the tank, causing it to immediately catch fire. Another tank was spotted nearby and was also hit by an artillery shell. The same fate befell this tank. It caught fire and burned for a long time until its interior was completely consumed. Eventually, the turret of the tank was blown off. Yet another Russian tank was detected and disabled by artillery fire. Like the others, it caught fire and burned out entirely from the inside. The Russians are using heavy FAB-500 bombs. However, this tactic does not always prove successful. Furthermore, Ukrainian forces have made advancements in several locations, penetrating more than 5 kilometers into Russian defense lines. Take a look at this video posted by the Russians. We can see a Ukrainian armored personnel carrier moving towards the Russian defense and falling into an anti-tank trench. There's also a line of what they call dragon's teeth, which are anti-tank obstacles. This suggests that the Ukrainian forces have come really close to the main line of Russian defense, having overcome minefields. It's interesting to note that the Ukrainian armored personnel carrier isn't encountering any resistance from the Russians here, except for the deep trench. The Russians are getting a persistent fear of Ukrainian drones. Destroying a tank with a Javelin missile may look epic, but it cost at least $80,000. An FPV drone cost around $500. Here's an example of how this tactic works. An FPV drone disabled a Russian tank from behind. Of course, the tank is not destroyed, but it is damaged. We see how the Russians abandoned this tank. And then the Ukrainians finished it off by dropping a grenade on it. Typically, such tanks are no longer usable. Later on, these tanks can still be used for spare parts for Ukrainian tanks if they haven't been completely burned out. The crew of this armored transporter, upon seeing the drone, decided to turn back but hit a mine and exploded. Next, a Grad BM-21 launcher was spotted near an ammunition depot. Russian artillerymen were loading their Grad rocket system. But luck was not on their side today as they were detected, and the coordinates were relayed to the HIMARS crew. Just one rocket turned the location into hell. Ammunition started exploding, and the Grad launcher was destroyed.
Drones have played a crucial role for Ukraine and Russia. On Monday, the Security Service of Ukraine posted a video of an FPV drone flying into a Russian vehicle carrying at least 3 soldiers while driving through a Ukrainian village. Russia's stash of Iranian-made drones has allowed the Kremlin to carry out airstrikes throughout Ukraine. Last week, Ukrainian officials said they were able to strike down 16 out of 21 Shahed-136 drones launched by Russia in an overnight assault on several regions, including Kiev. These drones can reach over 100 miles an hour. The payload will be higher than the GoPro often seen on similar drones, but pilots have no need to worry about saving the battery for the return. This might well explain the recurring complaints about parts shortages in the FPV forums. Donation of drones is also consuming major brands. Ukrainian oligarch Pavel Furks, or philanthropist as Ukrainian news puts it, has been credited with buying and supplying stacks of DJI drones.
DJI says Aeroscope is intended only for law enforcement uses, but Mikhailo, a drone expert from Ukraine's Aerorozvidka organization, confirmed to RFE-RL that unfortunately, examples exist of Ukrainians being targeted and killed by Russian users of the system. Aerorozvidka this week marks its 8th year of operation. The Ukrainian organization began as a group of drone enthusiasts who saw the potential for quadcopter technology in warfare.
British-trained Ukrainian troops have entered the fray as counteroffensives mount against Russia. Earlier this week, Russian President Vladimir Putin confirmed there had been intensive fighting in southern Ukraine. On Thursday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky published a video showing his country's troops saying they had captured the village of Staromayorsk in Donetsk and a group of soldiers waving the Ukrainian flag. Located 150 kilometers east of Zaporizhzhia, the army liberated the area through the use of artillery fire and airstrikes. Ukraine and its allies suggest recent advances to yield further and even more important gains. However, Ukraine acknowledged that Russia was making it difficult for Western-supplied military equipment, including tanks, to move forward. The Russians have fortified miles of territory with mines and tank booby traps in an attempt to slow the Ukrainian advance. There were three axes for the Ukrainian counterattack: east towards the war-torn city of Bakhmut, southeast through Volodar, and south towards the city of Tokmak. And progress near Robotyne is part of the south axis. Today, 36 combat clashes took place on the front. The Russian Federation forces continued to wage a war of aggression, despite significant losses. Toward Bakhmut, the Ukrainian armed forces continued to take the initiative and carry out offensive actions to expel the invaders. According to reports, the Russians are currently intensifying offensive operations in the Mariinsky direction using equipment, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and this did not bring the invaders any success. The defense forces repelled all attacks and significantly reduced the enemy's offensive potential. On Monday, Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade shared footage of their fighters approaching the front line ahead of a confrontation with Russian troops. Footage from the front line of the Ukrainian counterattack shows the dramatic moment Ukrainian troops pounded Putin's troops and stormed their trenches while under heavy fire in Russian-occupied Bakhmut. The bodycam video shows teams of soldiers from the 3rd Assault Brigade storming the Russian positions, lining up behind the tanks and dodging shells and mines. Later drone footage shows the extraordinary moment when troops launch a barrage of fire on enemy positions and eliminate dozens of Russian soldiers there. Trenches were bombed at one point in the footage, which was fired by the drone after the attack was made. Ukrainian troops can be seen moving in and out of apparently abandoned Russian trenches. Here, Ukrainian soldiers also managed to take over Russian hideouts and trenches and forced Putin's troops to flee in terror. It happened when their president today visited the front lines and hailed their performance of duty for the sake of Ukraine as absolutely heroic. President Volodymyr Zelensky said he was visiting Ukrainian special forces in an outpost near the Bakhmut hotspot as Kyiv stepped up its counteroffensive. Zelensky also said he was not free to disclose details of the special forces' current operations, but stressed that its members had recently helped retake the village of Staromayorsk from Russian troops on the southern front. On the Lymanov-Kupian direction, the Russian army also unsuccessfully attempted to seize the initiative and go on the offensive. According to Cherevedi, 35 colonists were killed, 65 were injured, and 5 were captured in this direction over the past day. In addition, an enemy tank, an armored personnel carrier, and 2 field warehouses with ammunition were destroyed. According to the spokesman, such losses forced the enemy to take rotational measures to move troops. To date, the Ukrainian Defense Forces have eliminated 245,700 and another 450 in the last 24 hours alone. According to Russian media, the Russian army also launched counteroffensive and partially recaptured positions in the Robotyne area. As part of an active confrontation in the Zaporizhzhia direction, the Russian armed forces managed to organize a successful counterattack and regain control of a number of key positions previously lost to the northeast of the village of Robotyne. According to available information, Russian artillery is actively shelling the positions of Ukrainian military personnel in several settlements. In response to the activities of the Russian troops, The Ukrainian side also used artillery to bombard the positions of the Russian armed forces in the settlements of Zherbianka, Ravitino, and Verbov. Successful counterattacks will allow the Russian armed forces to regain control of strategically important positions, which may significantly affect the further course of hostilities in the area. Meanwhile, Ukraine has won back significant land from occupied Russian troops in the ongoing counteroffensive in the south and east of the country, according to the latest battlefield maps published by the Institute for the Study of War. ISDU said Kyiv forces continued offensive operations in southern Zaporizhia Oblast and eastern Donetsk Oblast, while defending against new Russian offensives in northeastern Luhansk Oblast. Ukrainian offensives in recent days have reportedly focused on sections of the Zaporizhia front near the towns of Orykiv and Robotyne, and on a Vermivka salient along the administrative border between Zaporizhia and Donetsk Oblasts, where Kyiv troops on Thursday claimed to have liberated the village. Staromayorsky. ISDU geolocated battlefield footage on Wednesday showed an attack by Ukrainian mechanized troops had penetrated the Russian lines south of Orykiv and penetrated several miles back. Kyiv and its western backers will hope that the new gains are an indication that Ukraine's multi-pronged push is gradual, backed up by months of deep attacks on Russian command and supply centers, eroding Russia's capabilities and defense.
Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade penetrated Russian defenses south of Bakhmut by 1.5 kilometers, taking one of 2 main fortifications in the region. At the same time, other units secured the forest right near the city. Russian forces south of Bakhmut are now in a pocket and will likely have to retreat further, after securing the western part of the canal south of Ukraine's city of Bakhmut in the country's east. Ukrainians launched the next phase of the operation, crossed the canal, and started taking Klishklivka village in a pocket. The Russian assault deployed 2 armored columns, each led by 3 heavy T-90 tanks and trailed by 8 to 10 lighter infantry fighting vehicles, and aimed at high ground overlooking Klishklivka and the neighboring village of Andrivka, Ukrainian military information telegram channel said. Drone video posted by the usually reliable Ukrainian military blogger Osint URI showed the Andrivka sector column being shot to bits in a series of accurate shell strikes. Ukrainian strikes on Russian rear areas are demonstrably degrading the morale of Russian forces in Ukraine, and this could threaten the stability of Russian defenses on multiple critical areas of the front, the ISW said. Ukraine is 3 months into a counteroffensive to recapture Russian-occupied territory seized throughout President Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion. The ISW said morale issues can quickly intensify and spread among Russian frontline units if one unit under pressure breaks, which in turn could spread panic and significantly reduce the combat effectiveness of other Russian forces. Despite Russian attempts at a counterattack, Ukrainian positions within the forest proved instrumental, leading to Russian troops becoming caught in the crossfire and ultimately retreating. Each side controls roughly 35% of the village, leaving the remaining portion in a congested gray area. Recent developments have also seen Russian forces being pushed out of at least one tree line to the west of the village entirely, with several more being partially vacated. Considering the Russian forces' limited capacity to utilize ground communication lines for supply delivery and troop rotation, holding the settlement for an extended duration appears unlikely. Ukraine on Friday reported fierce fighting along its entire front line and some success in pushing back Moscow's troops in one part of the southeast where Ukrainian forces are trying to retake Russian-occupied territory. Progress has been hampered by widespread Russian-laid minefields and strong fortifications, Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Millar said. But the Ukrainian military had pushed forward around the village of Staromorsky, around 60 miles southwest of Russian-held Donetsk, and was pressing on 2 fronts in south, Millar said. Ukrainian forces have made incremental gains since kicking off their long-awaited operation in June, but officials in Kiev have acknowledged that processes have been slower than they would like and hampered by rigid Russian defenses. In Monday's statement, Millar described the nature of that challenge. The armed forces are facing complete mining of the territory, cement fortifications of the key heights, and constant mortar and artillery shelling, she said. Additionally, the Russians are densely using aviation. Today, multiple Ukrainian fighters reported that Ukrainians have finally pushed Russians out of the forests south of Bakhmut. One fighter stated that today, the forest was indistinguishable from hell. Russian sources reported that Ukrainian artillery was so concentrated on this particular region as if they aimed to erase it from the ground. Overall, Ukrainians have penetrated Russian defenses simultaneously from 2 sides, and are effectively encircling the most powerful Russian fortification in this region. Ideally, they would aim to take it without a fight, because not only is it one of the most extensive trench networks developed, but it also is located on a hill near the village, which makes it very easy to supply the troops.
Russia is similarly operating effective air defenses, as it is well known for its advanced S-400 and S-500 air defenses. Given the range of these air defenses, which often extend more than several hundred kilometers of radar tracking area, a large portion of the airspace can be covered by a small number of mobile air defenses. This amounts to a circumstance wherein medium and higher altitude ISR platforms such as the Reaper, Grey Eagle, or EMARS, Enhanced Medium Altitude Reconnaissance and Surveillance System, spy plane, are not likely to yield fast or safe image returns, given that they are simply far too vulnerable to being destroyed by ground defenses. Russian targets are chosen after flying surveillance drones toward their positions and a combination of additional intelligence from other Ukrainian units. Following comprehensive information about the targets and their surroundings in this case, a team of Russian soldiers firing Kornet anti-tank guided missiles, ATGM, toward their troops, the Ukrainian drone unit drives to the spot in complete darkness with their headlights turned off. The Russian Army's 3-person, 53-ton BMPT Terminator tank support vehicle combines the thickly armored hull of a T-72 tank with an unmanned turret packing twin 30mm autocannons and launchers for 4 anti-tank missiles. The Terminator is tough enough to assault enemy positions alongside the tanks and nimble enough, with its fast-firing high-elevation autocannons, to do battle with fleet-footed enemy infantry. The Russian Army lost its first BMPT out of 10 Uralvagonzavod built for the service in a precision artillery strike in eastern Ukraine in February. It may have lost a second over the weekend after several speedy grenade-clutching FPV drones struck the Terminator in Donetsk.
Let's hope that the Ukrainian soldiers were able to escape from there. The next day, the Ukrainians destroyed 2 more Russian tanks. One of the tanks was hit by a Javelin missile and soon caught fire. The second tank spotted the Ukrainian position and decided to attack it. But it also received a hit from an anti-tank missile. In the video, you can see some part of it flying off in a spiral trajectory, but the tank continued moving, increasing its speed until it hit a mine on the road. Also note how the Ukrainian drone drops a bomb on a moving Russian tank. We haven't seen anything like this before. The task of the Ukrainian army here is very simple: to destroy as much Russian tanks and other armored vehicles as possible. Ukrainians have good air reconnaissance and monitor everything that happens. As a result of accurate hits, the Russians are losing more and more. Russian armored vehicles and tanks constantly burn and explode on approach to the city or in the city itself. And Russian fighter aircrafts which still dare to fly around the city also crash and explode. Now, we are going to show you another failure of Russian troops near the Vuhledar town in Ukraine. A column of 6 Russian tanks and 1 infantry fighting vehicle began an attack on Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainian troops let them approach the edge of the town, where they ambushed them with Javelin missiles. When the tanks approached the right distance, the Ukrainian troops opened fire. The first tank was immediately knocked out of the game. Then the Ukrainians destroyed another tank. And then one more. The armored vehicle pushed forward, but was also hit by a Ukrainian missile. The Russians are forced to abandon their vehicle as it catches fire. They press their heads to the ground, expecting the vehicle to explode. Perhaps it is full of ammunition. Then the Ukrainians began to hunt down the remaining tanks. One of the tanks noticed the Ukrainian troops' ambush and began shooting at them while retreating. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians missed the tank this time. Meanwhile, the previously hit tank spectacularly exploded from the detonation of the shells. Almost nothing was left of the tank except for scraps of metal. The abandoned Russian armored vehicle burned for a long time, but eventually exploded as well. Russian soldiers have a habit of creating small weapon depots in civilian houses and then hiding there themselves. Ukrainian artillery constantly strikes at them, leaving them no chance. While retreating, Ukrainians sometimes leave well-fortified multi-story buildings to the Russians. Russian squads occupy the building and set up their positions there. But the building turned out to be secretly mined, and at night, the Ukrainians blew it up along with the Russians. But the Russians have also had successes. Look at the road leading to Bakhmut. The Russians constantly shell it, making it impossible to travel during the day without getting caught in the shelling. Javelin missiles continue to provide invaluable assistance to the Ukrainians in repelling attacks, and the Russians are still unable to resist them. And here's my favorite case of using a Javelin missile. A Ukrainian soldier let 2 Russian tanks pass by, and then came out of hiding behind them and destroyed them. This is a true guerrilla warfare. Here are a few more accurate hits on Russian armored vehicles. A camera installed on a Russian tank captured the moments when a tank ahead of it was destroyed by a Ukrainian Javelin missile. Currently, Ukrainian soldiers have more of these missiles. Sometimes Ukrainian forces even use them when they are not needed. For example, we see a Russian tank that is already disabled, but Ukrainians fired another Javelin missile at it, probably to finish it off. Ukrainian forces also use another type of anti-tank missile.
Ukrainian official sources reported failed Russian armored attacks at both locations, but did not specify Russian losses. The T-90 is Russia's latest model tank currently used in the field in Ukraine. Kremlin spokesmen have billed the vehicle as superior to Western first-line tanks in firepower, and comparable to them in armor and defense systems. A relatively rare and expensive tank by Russian army standards, the T-90 has fought in Ukraine since the start of Russia's February 2022 full-scale invasion. Members of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade of Ukraine also posted a video from Bakhmut front showing their capture of some Russian occupiers. One of the Russians attempted to pull the pin out of a hand grenade as they approached, so they were forced to kill him. The video shows Commander Datsk of the 2nd Platoon and his subordinates, who call themselves Decepticons, a reference to the fearsome robots in the Transformers, storming the Russians and taking them prisoner. "We have more humanity than anyone else," they say. The assaults on the eastern bank of the canal were extremely successful because Ukrainians managed to advance up to 1.5 kilometers toward Klishkivka, slowly penetrating the Russian rear. And this is extremely important because the whole southern Bakhmut flank relies on just 2 powerful fortifications, one north of Klishkivka and one west of Klishkivka. The fact that the Ukrainians have advanced 1.5 kilometers means that one of these 2 fortifications has fallen. If we look at the satellite footage, we can see that this was an incredibly powerful strongpoint, which basically consists of a net of trenches right near the tree line. So by conducting such a rapid advance, Ukrainians took Russians by surprise with a deep penetration. Based on ongoing trends, analysts predict that Ukrainians will likely attempt to create a salient and, if feasible, encircle Russian forces within Robotny. In response to the Ukrainian threat, Russian forces have introduced Ka-52 helicopters to the region, aiming to neutralize the Ukrainian heavy equipment fueling these attacks. Recent reports indicate that this morning, Ukrainians employed up to 4 tanks and armored fighting vehicles, prompting the dispatch of helicopters to eliminate the threat. Unfortunately for Russians, the 47th Brigade of Ukrainian fighters was prepared and successfully downed one such helicopter. The twin battles in the Klishivka sector came some 4 weeks after AFU units occupied high ground in the vicinity, and then retreated to catch counter-attacking Russian troops in the ambush. Infantry from the AFU's 80th Air Assault Brigade sent small arms, grenades, and mortars in the June 25th ambush. Video showed at least 11 Russian paratroopers killed or wounded in the 2-minute engagement. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister on Monday said Ukraine's forces had recaptured a clutch of territory around the eastern war-battered town of Bakhmut, but made no major advances on the southern front. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev said on Tuesday that 185,000 new recruits had joined the Russian army as professional contract soldiers since the start of the year. Meanwhile, a senior Ukrainian security official says Kiev's troops are fulfilling the #1 task in their counteroffensive against Russian forces and have had a particularly fruitful last few days. At this stage of active hostilities, Ukrainians' defense forces are fulfilling the #1 task, the maximum destruction of manpower, equipment, fuel depots, military vehicles, command posts, artillery, and air defense forces of the Russian army, Oleksiy Danilov wrote on Twitter. Russian sources have noted an increase in Ukrainian force concentration within the tree lines north of Robotny, indicating a potential upcoming wave of attacks. Complaints from Russian sources have emerged regarding the Ukrainian use of Leopard tanks from considerable distances, making identification and destruction challenging. Ukrainian fighters have clarified that these Leopards are primarily employed as long-range snipers for fire support. This approach enables them to unleash swift and devastating fire from several kilometers away, minimizing machine exposure. A broken Russian frontline unit would threaten the integrity of other frontline defenses, and such a break in the Russian frontline would provide a vulnerability that Ukraine forces could exploit, the think tank added, assessing that Moscow's forces likely lack the necessary reserves to rotate out or quickly replace a broken unit, making the preservation of morale in the frontline units imperative. Ukraine forces are likely also working to increase the likelihood of Russian forces breaking under the pressure caused by morale issues, the ISW said. After the Russians lost control over the forest, this part of their defense line became rather weak. Russian supplies were extremely undermined due to the extensive visual control over the fields and roads. Ukrainians exploited this weakness by unleashing their artillery on the main Russian logistics center of this group, and Rivka, in order to swiftly penetrate Russian positions and clear as much ground as possible. Ukrainians used tanks. The tanks advanced along the tree belts and used high explosive shells to demolish Russian trenches and any other fortifications. Each such raid was immediately followed by an infantry assault that completely cleared and secured positions. Skilled Armed Forces of Ukraine AFU gunners using NATO standard howitzers lured the Russian attack formation into a kill zone before hitting it while it was moving, he said. The shell ambush geolocated the eastern approaches of Adrivka village, destroyed at least 3 T-90s, 1 MTLB light armored vehicle, and 1 BMP infantry fighting vehicle, a later OSINT report said. According to the military blogger Tom Cooper, citing Russian sources, as few as 3 Russian infantry fighting vehicles from the Klishkivka and Andrivka fights combined made it back to Russian lines. All the T-90s were knocked out, he said.
In these video footage, the Russians were launching a counterattack but ended up losing all their tanks to the mine barrier set up by Ukrainian soldiers. The front line is so saturated with mines that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians can advance quickly. The Russians have mined vast areas, dug numerous trenches, and filled them with personnel. However, the United States plans to provide the Ukrainian army with cluster munitions. These projectiles can more efficiently target enemy personnel and lightly armored vehicles over larger areas. This will fundamentally change the situation on the front line and allow the Ukrainians to advance much faster. Ukrainian forces are increasingly using the HIMARS and M270 rocket launchers to directly destroy Russian military equipment. Aerial reconnaissance has located 2 Russian BM-21 Grad rocket artillery systems. They will now be destroyed by a HIMARS missile. Just a reminder, the Russian BM-21 Grad is the most common multiple rocket launcher system in the Russian army. So, the HIMARS delivers a missile strike. The Grad BM is destroyed. It's on fire, and then all its projectiles explode. The second HIMARS missile destroyed another Grad BM launcher. Another Grad BM launcher was detected nearby and also destroyed by a HIMARS missile. This is a routine and daily practice. Here's another Grad launcher. And once again, the HIMARS missile hits its target. And now we have a large caliber target. A Russian self-propelled howitzer, the Tu-S-19 is hiding among the trees. However, the HIMARS missile destroys it. Another Tu-S-19 self-propelled howitzer is destroyed by a HIMARS missile. The Russian self-propelled artillery system Tornado is also positioned amidst the green trees. The HIMARS receives the coordinates and delivers a missile strike to that location. And although the missile hit very close, you have no doubt that the target is affected. The destructive power of the M31A1 missile is enormous. The warhead of the missile can impact targets within a radius of up to 150 meters from the point of detonation. Pay attention to this powerful explosion. It's the explosion of a Russian armored personnel carrier. Sometimes, the Russians load explosives into armored vehicles and send them towards Ukrainian positions. However, the Ukrainians detonate them in advance. In this forest plantation, one such armored personnel carrier loaded with explosives was stopped. It caught fire and later exploded. An explosion of such magnitude can destroy a fortified bunker, which is why the Russians use this tactic. Now, Here's a unique video. The Russians hastily abandoned the armored vehicle filled with explosives. According to their plan, this armored vehicle was supposed to reach the Ukrainian bunker on its own and detonate it. However, the Ukrainians destroy this armored personnel carrier in advance using an anti-tank missile. Here's another example. A Russian armored personnel carrier was moving towards Ukrainian positions. Ukrainian soldiers fired an anti-tank missile at it. The enormous explosion once again proves that there was a significant amount of explosive material in the vehicle. And here, the Russians loaded an old T-55 tank with 6 tons of TNT. The Ukrainians hit it with a grenade launcher, causing an explosion with an incredible force of the blast wave. Ukrainian artillery is also destroying another important Russian equipment. Reconnaissance has detected the Uragan multiple rocket launcher system. This system launches unguided rockets with significant destructive power. Using the Uragan systems, the Russians daily shelled Ukrainian cities near the front lines, causing significant damage to the infrastructure. And with just a single Excalibur projectile, they managed to hit the target and destroy this devastating Russian weapon. And here's the destruction of the 2 S-5 artillery system using a HIMARS missile. The Russians concealed the SA-15 Gauntlet surface-to-air missile system among the trees. It is designed to engage and destroy aerial targets, including aircraft, helicopters, and unmanned aerial vehicles. It is a highly valuable weapon worth up to $10 million. But the Ukrainians tracked its coordinates and destroyed it with just one HIMARS missile. The uncontrolled explosion of ammunition confirms the destruction of the system. It is evident that the Ukrainian army has accumulated enough HIMARS ammunition to actively employ them during their counteroffensive. Currently, the command of the Ukrainian army is focused on destroying as much Russian artillery and other military capabilities as possible, and only then will it be possible to deliver the main strike and break through the Russian defense. One of the main tasks is to destroy as many Russian ammunition as possible, which they typically hide among thickets and trees. Take a look at this video. Ukrainian reconnaissance found a bunch of Russian anti-tank mines among the trees. To destroy it, it was enough to drop one grenade from a drone. The explosion created a crater in the ground, and all the trees burned down. In this video, we can witness the detonation of a large number of ammunition hidden among the trees. Recently, the Ukrainians tracked down a large ammunition depot in abandoned buildings on the outskirts of the city of Donetsk. Take a look at how skillfully and accurately the Ukrainian forces are using precision-guided munitions like the Excalibur. Today, I'll show you the best moments of the combat actions. In this video, you can see a Russian self-propelled howitzer 2S9 taking position in a forested area. The Ukrainian forces noticed it and delivered a precise strike with just a single projectile. It resulted in a massive explosion since the ammunition detonated along with the howitzer. The Russian tank attempted to hide from the Ukrainian artillery behind the trees, but the Ukrainian reconnaissance spotted its location. A precision strike with an Excalibur guided projectile was launched against the tank. The result is evident. Here's another instance where a Russian modern tank, the T-90, was detected by Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance. It was targeted with an Excalibur projectile and destroyed. Additionally, the Excalibur projectile destroys numerous Russian artillery systems like the 2S-19 and Grad BM-1, as well as multiple ammunition depots hidden by the Russians in abandoned houses and gardens. Watch how the projectiles explode and scatter in different directions. The Excalibur is a highly advanced 155mm caliber projectile equipped with GPS guidance and can be fired from almost any NATO standard 155mm howitzer. It is evident that in preparation for the offensive, the Ukrainian army has stockpiled a sufficient number of such projectiles to destroy hundreds or even thousands of units of Russian equipment. Economically, this is also a favorable exchange. The cost of a single projectile is approximately $100,000, whereas it can destroy a tank worth $3 million or other significant Russian equipment. Interestingly, the Russians do not possess such highly accurate artillery capabilities. As a result, in order to hit a target, the Russians have to use hundreds of projectiles and old 40-year-old howitzers or resort to multiple rocket launch systems. Consequently, the Russians will sooner or later experience a severe shortage of ammunition. In their attempts to halt the Ukrainian offensive, The Russians are conducting clumsy counterattacks, but they are losing even more armored vehicles. The Russians are repelling tank attacks using RPGs. The camera on a Ukrainian tank captured the moment when an anti-tank grenade flew past the tank. A minute later, another grenade struck the tank. Here are two Russian tanks that ventured out for a counterattack, but the Ukrainians destroyed one of the tanks with a precise hit from an anti-tank missile. The Russian artillerymen were assigned to shell Ukrainian positions with the heavy Tornado S multiple rocket launcher. They took positions between the trees, and one of the launchers managed to launch a rocket strike. However, Ukrainian reconnaissance immediately detected them and delivered a precise strike. The first Tornado S launcher started exploding as its rockets began to fly uncontrollably, but the second launcher managed to leave the position in time and avoided destruction. We can see the Ukrainian projectile landing precisely where the Russians were, albeit with a slight delay. But let's get back to the HIMARS rocket artillery system. The HIMARS operator group, along with aerial reconnaissance, set out on a mission. Their objective is to destroy enemy artillery. The first target was the Russian Uragan multiple rocket launcher. After the missile strike, it caught fire until it became inoperable. Another Uragan was discovered off the edge of the forest and also destroyed. Shortly after, the Ukrainians conducted a successful operation in the same location, on the Dnieper River. Using a reconnaissance drone, the Ukrainian Coast Guard spotted a Russian sabotage group attempting to infiltrate an island and set up an observation post. Ukrainian military forces suddenly appeared at the right place at high speed. Two Ukrainian military boats were dispatched to eliminate the Russian observation post. The Russians opened fire with small arms first, but were suppressed by the heavy machine guns mounted on the Ukrainian boats. The Ukrainians fired from both boats at different angles. As a result, the Russians were eliminated and the boats retreated and hid in ambush. After some time, the Russians sent their boat for support, but from the ambush, Ukrainian forces struck the boat with an FPV drone. The boat was damaged. The Russians sent another boat to tow it, but during the towing operation, the Ukrainians launched another drone and struck the second boat. As a result, both Russians began to swim to save themselves. By the way, Russian anti-aircraft missile systems sometimes attempt to shoot down even small reconnaissance drones. In this video, we see a missile miss and fly past the drone. They don't hesitate to use expensive missiles as Ukrainian reconnaissance guides the HIMARS missiles using these drones. Next, a very valuable exhibit was spotted, the RB-301 Electronic Warfare Complex. A HIMARS missile turned it into unusable scrap metal. Another Grad launcher was also destroyed nearby. Two more Grad BM-21 launchers were discovered in the bushes at another location. Unfortunately, the first rocket did not destroy the Grad launcher, possibly due to imprecise coordinates, but the second rocket launcher burned the second Grad launcher. Soon, another Grad launcher was discovered and destroyed. Then, a large caliber artillery installation was detected and also destroyed by a HIMARS missile. It burned along with its ammunition. Ukrainians have realized that it is much cheaper to destroy Russian armored vehicles using small FPV drones rather than using expensive Javelin missiles. This Russian armored transporter was disabled by an FPV drone, and then another grenade was thrown at it. As a result, it exploded and was destroyed. Next, the Russian Buk air defense system was discovered among the trees. With a precise hit from a HIMARS missile, it was destroyed. Look at the fireworks and how its projectiles detonate. By the way, did you notice this truck? These trucks deliver ammunition to the artillerymen. We have a video where one of these Russian trucks detonates on a mine along with its cargo. And reconnaissance spotted a Russian logistics convoy. Several HIMARS rockets were launched at it, and the convoy was completely incinerated. Reconnaissance discovered another Uragan multiple rocket launcher. The Russians were preparing to launch their rockets, but the HIMARS missile beat them to it. The guys didn't even have time to run away. And nearby, scouts found another Uragan multiple rocket launcher and delivered a precise strike to it. Ukrainian artillerymen ruthlessly destroy enemy vehicles. Anything marked with the letter Z must be destroyed and burned by any means necessary. The Russian troops try to destroy the most valuable Ukrainian M777 howitzers by attacking them with Lancet kamikaze drones, and they often succeed. Sometimes, the Lancet hits projectiles near the howitzer. In this video, we see how a Ukrainian soldier is trying to save shells from detonation. Dangerous, but necessary work. The M777 howitzer can still be repaired, but the shells cannot. Exploding, they can do more damage than a Russian drone. In order to protect the howitzers, the Ukrainians cover them with such nets. This is a personal video from a Ukrainian soldier. It is the first battle in his life. These guys are taking the brunt of the enemy artillery. Before advancing, the Russians pour tons of artillery shells on them. And then they advance with the supportive mortar fire. Ukrainian soldiers must first survive under artillery strikes, and then repel attacks on their positions. The enemy is trying to cut off the roads that supply the city. They are trying to surround the city and force the Ukrainian troops to leave. Bakhmut is already in a semi-encircled, but as long as there is a road to it, the city can be held. In these video footage, you can see the presumed use of the American high-precision bomb, JDAM, in the Bakhmut city. Several videos have leaked online confirming this, and if it is true, the Russians should definitely worry. The JDAM bomb is dropped from an aircraft and can fly up to 40 miles, hitting the target precisely and causing significant damage to enemy structures. See, for example, how the Americans bombed JDAM in Afghanistan. A small village was wiped off the face of the earth. When the Ukrainian army goes on the counteroffensive, the Russians' fortified positions will also be swept away by this massive fire. Ukrainians destroy enemy armored vehicles with artillery strikes. The Excalibur's unique high-precision guided projectile allows them to destroy tanks with pinpoint accuracy. It is controlled by aerodynamic rudders and uses GPS. In fact, it turns Ukrainian howitzers into large-caliber sniper rifles, capable of hitting single targets tens of kilometers away. The Russians can only dream of such accuracy. They don't have high-precision artillery at all. Because of this, they spend more ammo than they need. But most of all, Russians love to use MLRS systems. This is the most indiscriminate weapon ever made. The Bakhmut city and its surroundings look like a landscape after the First World War just because of this type of weapon. Hundreds and thousands of exploding shells destroy houses and trees, mixing everything with the ground. But for now, the Russians have concentrated all their forces to surround the Bakhmut city. They are attacking it from the north and south, trying to cut off supplies to the Ukrainian troops. Fire adjustment is conducted from a hidden observation post. Each successful hit brings joy to the Ukrainian commanders. Mortars almost never stop in Bakhmut. On the eastern side, the fighting is already taking place directly on the streets of the city. The enemy is trying to occupy the buildings and turn them into strongholds. Once peaceful houses become a battlefield. The Ukrainian command consults every few days on the need to hold Bakhmut. The effectiveness ratio is currently in favor of Ukraine. This means that the enemy is suffering much more losses here than Ukraine. Bakhmut buys time while the main forces of the Ukrainian army prepare for a major counteroffensive. This is how the Russians hope to win, by leaving behind scorched earth. And this is the 2S7 self-propelled howitzer, the most powerful Russian gun. Its 203mm shell is capable of reaching up to 20 miles and causing enormous damage to the enemy. Fortunately, the Russians do not have many of these shells, and then use them not often. Ukrainians actively use the M270 launcher near Bakhmut. It's like doubled HIMARS. Ukrainians hide it in the forest as it is a very valuable weapon. It has an important role to play to destroy enemy ammunition depots, command posts, and enemy MLRS systems. Every day, Ukrainians destroy some large Russian depot, as you can see on the footage. On the outskirts of the Bakhmuts, Ukrainian troops defend their positions in trenches. Ukrainians have to fight for every street, for every house. The most difficult thing is to knock the enemy out of the buildings. To do this, you have to use a large caliber machine gun. And in the most difficult situations, only tanks can help. The Russians are not afraid to use fighter jets, knowing that the Ukrainians can easily shoot down their planes. In these footage, you can see a downed Russian Su-25 on fire. The pilot ejected and parachuted down to ground. Ukrainians also actively use aviation, Mi-8 helicopters. But the main striking force is still artillery. Let me tell you about the road to Bakhmut. Ukrainians call it the Road of Life. Every day and night, Ukrainian troops are supplied along it. And on the way back, they transport the wounded. You can see a lot of destroyed Ukrainian equipment along the Road of Life. This is because the enemy often shells the road. Many vehicles never make it to the city with food supplies, and many of the wounded never made it out. It's one of the saddest places in Ukraine. Sometimes, even the weather complicates life on the front line. Due to the rains, the ground becomes muddy and turns into a swamp. This brings additional moral discomfort to the soldiers. It is especially difficult when water appears in the trenches. Heavy armored vehicles cannot pass through the dirt roads. These roads become an additional challenge for the soldiers. Mud complicates logistics and takes away precious time. As you know, armored vehicles like firm ground. Only then can the army advance quickly and successfully. The Russians can barely break into Bakhmut with armored vehicles. Therefore, they rely on the infantry and constantly send them into assaults. Against them, the Ukrainians mainly use 60 and 80 caliber mortars. This is the most effective weapon against the advancing infantry. The Russians also use the Lancet drones to destroy other important Ukrainian weapons, such as the Stormer HVM air defense system. But Ukrainians also have kamikaze drones. On this video footage, you can see how they are used on enemy armored vehicles. Tank destroyed too. And on this video, Ukrainian drones tracked down and destroyed 2 Russian air defense systems. Take a look at this video. A Russian armored personnel carrier is rushing forward at full speed. The danger ahead is obvious. The road is clearly mined. There are craters on the road from previously detonated mines. Destroyed vehicle lies to the side. But the Russians seem to ignore the danger, and the result was disastrous. These are not rare cases. It happens systematically. Here's another example. It's obvious that the road here is mined. The mines are even visible in the drone footage. These are direct action Soviet trade mines. But the driver of the Russian armored personnel carrier drives forward like a kamikaze. As a result, the transport was destroyed. But it's amazing that the crew survived such an impact. And here's another case. A Russian armored personnel carrier is attempting to pass through the same spot where 2 other armored personnel carriers were already blown up before it. The result was predictable, but the crew also survived. As you already know, Ukrainian soldiers mine not only roads, but also roadsides along the roads, especially at intersections. And it seems like the Russians are unable to learn this lesson. Here's another interesting case confirming this. A Russian tank is attempting to approach the Ukrainian positions along the roadside. They think that the road is mined, but the roadside is clear. But they were wrong. Shortly after, several other tanks tried to break through the same spot and were also blown up. In general, It turned out that stopping the Russian offensive is very easy. It's enough to simply mine the roads and shoulders. In this video, a Russian tank column is stopped. The first tank is blown up by a mine. Later, the entire column was destroyed by the Ukrainian military guys. This happens constantly. Russians do not change their tactics and do not learn from their mistakes. When there are battles in the city, Russian tanks ruthlessly shoot peaceful houses and cars. But let's return once again to mined roads. In this footage, we see how a Ukrainian Humvee ran over a Russian mine, after which it turned onto the roadside. But what's interesting is that the Humvee driver remained alive and calmly continued on foot. Obviously, the armored Humvee is well protected against mines. At a minimum, it can withstand the detonation of a Russian mine. Let me remind you that the United States provided Ukraine with enough of these vehicles for the movement of infantry. The Humvee is designed to protect against high levels of threats, such as bullets and explosions. It can withstand attacks from the side and above, making it safer for transporting passengers and cargo. And also, Humvee has high off-road capability, allowing it to traverse difficult terrain, including rough and unpaved roads. This is important for Ukrainian military. The Russians use several vehicles. The most common method is using the BMR-3M Vepr vehicle, which is mounted on a regular Russian tank. But this machine is not very effective. For example, in this video, the Vepr machine was able to detect and neutralize only 2 mines, and the third mine exploded and damaged the tank itself. And these were mines of Russian production. Against mines of Western production, this machine is powerless. The Russians have more complex demining machines. I already mentioned one of them in my previous video, the UR-77. This equipment was created specifically for demining roads, to allow tanks to advance during an offensive. It works from a safe distance and is quite effective. One reason for the failure of the Russian offensive in Ukraine is that the Russians simply cannot break through the minefields that the Ukrainians have created for them. With poor intelligence, the Russians constantly fall into traps and lose hundreds of armored vehicles. Look at this video that has already spread to the whole world. The Russians have turned their offensive into mountains of scrap metal, and it seems like they don't understand what's going on. Now, I'm going to tell you how it happens. First, Ukrainian sabotage groups penetrate key sectors of the front at night and set up special anti-tank mines. Basically, they use mines of German and French production. The mines are very powerful, capable of knocking over a Russian tank upside down with their explosion, as we see in these video footage.
Relying on their night vision goggles, they navigate the road and park several hundred meters away from their operational zone. Walking to the launch site, they prepare the drone and attach the nearly 20-kilogram drop bomb with 3 D-printed fins and pipes under the drone. SBU surveillance and electronic warfare specialists also intercept text messaging between Russian units, with one soldier messaging the other about a Ukrainian drone being heard. Inexpensive FPV drones, which might cost just $5,000 apiece, are some of the best and most cost-effective anti-vehicle weapons of Russia's 18-month wider war on Ukraine. Both sides have deployed the speedy drones which an operator controls via a virtual reality headset to damage or destroy hundreds of the enemy's armored vehicles. FPV drones are exactly the kind of opportunity we need to take to lower the risks of a Ukrainian soldier losing their life. Ukrainian Brigadier General Yuri Shkihol told Forbes contributor Sebastian Roblin,
Ukrainian officials announced on Tuesday that more than 2,200 FPV kamikaze drones will be purchased for combat thanks to a private fundraising effort. The project partnered with the country's largest salt producer, Artemsil, to sell a limited batch of salt derived from mines in Soledar, an eastern Ukrainian city that was captured by Russian forces in January.
Medium-altitude drones such as the Reaper or Grey Eagle are operated through data links operated by ground-based command and control stations, often hundreds of miles away. Smaller, more organic drones attached to specific mobile ground units, however, are quite different as they can be tasked and operated by close-in, hands-on forces in close proximity to the attacking ground units. This enables rapid tasking and immediate close-in combat ISR and attack value in a way larger fixed-wing surveillance or drones cannot. They are also much more expendable and simply too low altitude and near-ground units to be targeted effectively by larger air defense systems. Small, hand-launched drones, such as the Raven and Puma, emerged with the US Army years ago when maneuvering ground units recognized they could immeasurably benefit from small, close-in drones tied directly to and controlled by the ground forces themselves.
Eventually, the Russian armored personnel carriers were halted, and their crews fled the battlefield. The next Tu-S4 mortar launcher was spotted as it moved into a firing position. The Ukrainians waited for the mortar to reach its destination and then struck it with a HIMARS missile. As expected, the target was completely destroyed. In this video, one of these drones strikes a Russian armored personnel carrier. It was damaged and caught fire. A few minutes passed, and boom! The transporter suddenly exploded and soared into the air. Russian forces launched a counterattack to halt the advancement of the Ukrainian infantry, but were defeated. Parts of their tanks was destroyed by anti-tank missiles and grenades, while Ukrainian forces used drones to burn another portion of their armored vehicles. The Russian troops fled from the battlefield. Ukrainian forces have started advancing and have regained control of another settlement in the south of Ukraine. In an attempt to dislodge Ukrainian forces from the settlements, the Russians are using heavy FAB-500 bombs. However, this tactic does not always prove successful. In this video, you can see at least 9 units of destroyed Russian armored vehicles. The Russians are also facing losses in their aviation. In this video, you can witness the destruction of a Russian attack helicopter, the Ka-52 Alligator. One of the crew members in this downed helicopter was Colonel Vitaly Tabachnikov of the Russian aviation. This helicopter is considered the best attack helicopter in Russia, with an estimated cost of around $15 million. According to British intelligence data, the Ukrainian armed forces have successfully shot down more than a quarter of such helicopters. Take a look at this video posted by the Russians. We can see a Ukrainian armored personnel carrier moving towards the Russian defense and falling into an anti-tank trench. There's also a line of what they call dragon's teeth, which are anti-tank obstacles. This suggests that the Ukrainian forces have come really close to the main line of Russian defense, having overcome minefields. It's interesting to note that the Ukrainian armored personnel carrier isn't encountering any resistance from the Russians here, except for the deep trench. Take a look at this video. They hid a Russian armored transporter behind an industrial building, pressing it tightly to the wall. Ukrainian soldiers are on the other side. In this position, it's impossible to destroy the armored transporter with artillery or an anti-tank missile. However, thanks to a regular drone hovering in the air, we can observe the location of this target, and then a small FPV drone can fly around the corner of the building and strike the armored vehicle. And the cost of such an operation does not exceed $500. Isn't that amazing? Furthermore, Ukrainian forces have made advancements in several locations, penetrating more than 5 kilometers into Russian defense lines. All of this also means that Ukrainian forces will soon be able to break through the final line of Russian defense and enter the open operational space, where they can advance much faster. For nearly 2 months, the Ukrainian army has been navigating through Russian minefields, suffering significant losses of armored vehicles. However, in some places, the Ukrainians managed to breach the first line of defense. Recently, the Russian defense has noticeably weakened due to the significant loss in armored vehicles, artillery, and personnel within the Russian army. The Russian forces still have sufficient resources in the south of Ukraine to repel the counteroffensive. Unwilling to allow the Ukrainians to advance, the Russians are committing all their forces to launch counterattacks. In this video, we can see a Russian tank moving to support the infantry. The tank was spotted and a decision was made to strike it using an FPV drone. Interestingly, after the strike, the tank immediately exploded. Miraculously, one of the crew members survived and managed to escape from the tank. The disabled tank continued to burn for a while until it turned into scrap metal. Later, it was evident that the drone strike caused the tank's ammunition to detonate as the tank's turret was blown up. The Russians have also lost a considerable amount of ammunition as the Ukrainians effectively conducted strikes deep into the enemy's rear, destroying numerous ammunition depots. The Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance spotted a Russian T-80 tank. A precise artillery shot was fired directly at the rear of the tank, causing it to immediately catch fire. As I mentioned in my previous reports, the Russians almost immediately abandoned their armored vehicles when facing danger. Ukrainian drone operators are consistently engaged in destroying this abandoned armor if it is located in the gray zone and cannot be captured as a trophy. An interesting video has surfaced on the internet. Near the burnt tank, Russian soldiers held a funeral procession. They placed a wooden cross right next to the tank and prayed for their fallen comrade. Another soldier fired shots into the air, as is customary among military personnel. Judging by the remains of the disabled tank, you can imagine the magnitude of the explosion and what might have happened to the crew inside the tank. Another Russian tank was detected and disabled by artillery fire. Like the others, it caught fire and burned out entirely from the inside. Another tank was spotted nearby and was also hit by an artillery shell. The same fate befell this tank. It caught fire and burned for a long time until its interior was completely consumed. Eventually, the turret of the tank was blown off. The HIMARS rocket systems continued to destroy a lot of Russian equipment every day. 4 armored vehicles were hidden behind the trees, but one HIMARS missile destroyed them. However, HIMARS doesn't always hit the target accurately. In this video, 2 Grad BM rocket launchers were spotted. The first missile missed its target, but due to the shockwave, the Grad BM started launching its projectile spontaneously. The second missile also missed. Perhaps the Grad rocket launchers were damaged, but they remained intact nonetheless. HIMARS can miss only if incorrect coordinates were provided to it, and such mistakes sometimes happen. To give you an understanding, this mortar system is a highly dangerous weapon. It is equipped with a 240mm caliber gun and can launch projectiles up to a range of 10 kilometers, capable of destroying even heavily fortified bunkers. Ukrainian artillery also successfully targeted and hit 2 more S-24 self-propelled howitzers. The first Russian mortar was positioned in a visible and elevated location, making it an easy target for the Ukrainian artillery, which successfully hit and disabled it. And this is a larger target, the Russian Sanchepik rocket system. I've often told you how dangerous this weapon is. The Russians are using it against the advancing Ukrainian infantry. The operator directed the FPV drone straight into the compartment with rockets, and the rockets began detonating spontaneously. It looked like a massive fiery show. Drones can also be used against infantry in fortified trenches, and even for road clearing from mines. Here's another advantage of conventional drones over other types of weapons. Russian forces have also learned to use various types of drones against Ukrainian armored vehicles. Russian drones like Lancet pose a particular threat to Ukrainian troops. They are responsible for destroying the most armored vehicles. In the next episode, I will show you how many losses the Ukrainians suffer from Russian drone attacks and discuss ways to counter them.
Ukrainian troops have managed to retake nearly 15 square km, 5.8 square miles, of land from Russian troops to the east and south over the past week during their counteroffensive. The Ukrainian military is also doubling down on efforts to penetrate thick Russian defenses in its counteroffensive in the south, which has struggled to gain momentum since it was launched in early June. The challenges facing Ukraine are perhaps less related to numbers and have more to do with capability, training, and coordination, factors that are especially important when an attacking force is faced with so many defenses. Geolocated video fragments show that Western armored vehicles, such as the Bradley fighting vehicle, have become part of new offensives, and experienced units have been brought into battle. For weeks, Ukrainian troops have been struggling to break through the Russian lines because of the layers of defense, tank booby traps, other obstacles, and dense minefields. According to some Ukrainian accounts, they were forced to use small groups of military engineers working through forest areas to cut roads or avoid Russian-made minefields. Ukrainian forces appear to be struggling to carry out combined arms operations, the use of disparate assets to suppress and degrade Russian defenses, both in the air and on the ground. Today, 36 combat clashes took place on the Ukrainian front line. As usual, the Russian armed forces continued to wage a war of aggression, despite significant losses of personnel and combat equipment. Commander of the Armed Forces of the Ukrainian Army, Colonel General Oleksandr, said on Tuesday, Ukrainian troops managed to advance several kilometers towards Bakhmut and repel the Russian invaders there. He also shared footage from the Ukrainian army during blew up a Russian T-80 tank with 2 NLAW and Javelin shots. In the footage, 2 Russian tanks are blown to pieces after being hit by accurate fire from trained Ukrainian troops. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry also shared footage showing Ukrainian forces targeting and blowing up Russians hiding in dugouts in the Bakhmut region. In the video, several Russian soldiers can be seen running and hiding in the trenches to escape the Ukrainian rocket launcher fire. But unfortunately, thanks to effective Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance, several Russian soldiers were annihilated in a matter of seconds.
They do not know where to move because mines could be anywhere. While the Russians hesitate and make decisions, the Ukrainians shell them with artillery and javelin missiles from ambush. The Russians abandon their armored vehicles and flee. Then, the Ukrainians finish the job and burn the armored vehicles with drones, throwing grenades at them. I will show in more detail how this is done later. Ukrainian soldiers mine city streets to stop Russian tanks. In this video, we see a Russian tank advancing along the street and firing, but then it hits a mine. Interestingly, the Soviet anti-tank mine usually doesn't destroy the tank or armored personnel carrier. The tank crew almost always remains unhurt. The task of a mine is to stop a tank. Therefore, a characteristic sign that a tank has been blown up by a mine is torn tracks and damaged running gear. Sometimes, the wheels can even keep spinning, and the engine continues to run until it runs out of fuel. Tank crews usually leave such a tank with fear. To be fair, let's say that the Russian armored personnel carrier BMD is also capable of withstanding the impact of such a mine. Ukrainian soldiers found a BMD in the forest. We can see how the vehicle lost its track, and the suspension is damaged, but overall, the crew survived and probably fled the scene. To be fair, Ukrainian tanks also get blown up by mines as seen in these footage, but it's not a widespread phenomenon. Ukrainians usually act smarter. To clear mines from the roads, the Russians usually return for their tanks if possible to tow them for repairs. Now they have a severe shortage of heavy armored vehicles. Let me remind you that the Russians are losing more tanks than they can produce and repair. Therefore, in order to hinder the Russians, Ukrainian military forces try to destroy their tanks using drones. In this case, they have reached perfection. The drone drops a grenade right into the tank's turret hatch. Russian tank crews are to blame for this first. While fleeing, they almost always leave the hatch open. After the grenade explodes inside the tank, it usually blows up from the detonation of its own ammunition. But sometimes, there are small failures, as in this video. On the second attempt, the drone finally drops the grenade into the hatch, and that's the end of the tank. However, Ukrainians usually try to destroy this special equipment even before it does its job. Enemy tanks are trying to break into the city, but the Ukrainian artillery is not sleeping. An Excalibur projectile accurately destroyed a moving Russian tank. Later, another tank is destroyed while trying to enter the city.
Russia countered, saying its forces were improving their positions in the eastern region of Kharkiv and holding Ukraine's forces at bay further south. Kiev launched a counteroffensive against Russian troops in June after stockpiling Western weapons and building up offensive infantry units but has conceded that progress has been slow. Another 3 square kilometers, 1.1 square miles, has been liberated around Bakhmut. In total, 43 square kilometers around Bakhmut have been liberated since the offensive began, Hannah Millar told state television.
I found it interesting that Ukrainian tanks often closely approach Russian trenches and shoot at them point blank, and the Russians can do nothing about it. This may mean that they have an acute shortage of anti-tank weapons. Ukrainians are increasingly using tanks in counterattacks. If they need to clear a road of mines before proceeding, they use the American M58 mine clearing system. It's very helpful. In fact, the Ukrainians halted a major Russian offensive. This infuriates the Russians, and they call for the help of the most fierce artillery, the Sonchepek MLRS. All of this happens quickly, and within a few minutes, dangerous missiles rain down on the Ukrainian positions. However, the Russians continue to send live troops to the front line. Fearing the loss of many tanks, they rely on regular soldiers. Armored vehicles deliver several Russian platoons to the front line and then retreat back. The soldiers capture new positions in the forest. Later, a few more armored vehicles brought in additional assault Russian platoons. Their task is to create and hold fortified positions in this area. However, the Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance is observing everything and knows where to strike. Shortly after, the Ukrainians launch a powerful attack on the Russians using a guided JDAM bomb. Surviving such bombs is almost impossible, as it mixes the soldier with the ground and fire. Meanwhile, the Russians have almost captured the Bakhmut city. They brought tanks and armored vehicles into the city and are squeezing Ukrainian forces out. A Russian tank is firing directly at a Ukrainian position in a multi-story building. 2 American town missiles installed on the Humvee armored vehicle have proven to be very effective. They never miss. Brimstone missiles are well suited for targeting clusters of enemy equipment. Last year, Ukrainian forces destroyed a lot of Russian military vehicles using these missiles. After successfully repelling the Russian attack, Ukrainian tanks launched a counterattack to reclaim Russian positions. In these videos, we see a Ukrainian tank boldly approach Russian trenches and destroy a fortified position with direct fire. Shortly after, Ukrainian M113 armored personnel carrier opened machine gun fire on Russian infantry. Ukrainian soldiers disembarked and cleared the trenches. It was a successful operation. On the eastern region of Bakhmut, the Russians have set up a command post in a well-preserved building. They also install radio electronic reconnaissance antennas in Bakhmut, usually on the top of tall buildings. Ukrainian intelligence learned about this and launched an artillery strike on the command post. The headquarters caught fire, as did all the military equipment nearby. Later, the building was completely engulfed in flames. Then, the building exploded and collapsed, as there were many ammunition inside. The Ukrainians also destroyed reconnaissance systems using kamikaze drones. By the way, using small FPV drones, Ukrainians are inflicting serious damage to Russian troops. Take a look at these video clips. Russians are firing from an armored vehicle when suddenly they get hit by a Ukrainian drone. Another armored personnel carrier also gets hit by a drone, and then another one. There are rumors that Ukrainian forces may use tens of thousands of such drones during the next counteroffensive. The Ukrainians use British Brimstone missiles to target important Russian military equipment. These missiles are several times more powerful than Javelin missiles and can be launched from a regular civilian truck, and they hit their targets very accurately. The video captured the destruction of a Russian Tu-S3 howitzer that exploded along with its ammunition. Here's another video showing the destruction of another howitzer somewhere on the southern front that also exploded with its ammunition. Recently, we have seen several videos of downed Russian planes. Russians often forget they don't have air superiority in Ukraine. Look at the most advanced Russian tank, the T-90M, which is very rare in Russian army, but was brought here for the purpose of filming a news for Russian television. Recently, one of these tanks was discovered in the United States and taken to Louisiana for research purposes. However, the Russian tanks in Bakhmut don't last long. Soon they turn into scrap metal. the Ukrainians are also losing people and armored vehicles. For example, here is a burning Ukrainian M113 armored personnel carrier. The Russians even managed to capture one of these armored personnel carriers and are now using it, marking it with a letter Z. Also, Russian kamikaze drones called Lancet continue to create many problems. In this video, Lancet destroyed a Polish self-propelled howitzer Crowd, which exploded from the detonation of shells. Then it destroyed another howitzer. And when the Russians get angry, they unleash thousands of rocket artillery shells on Ukrainian troop positions. Overall, the Russians are fully preparing for defense. Ukrainians found 2 Russian M1990 self-propelled howitzers, and 2 accurate hits destroyed them, one by one. Ukrainians brought their skills to the point of art.
The suicide maritime drones used in the latest attack on a Russian Navy warship on the Black Sea on June 11th seem to belong to a new unmanned surface vessel, USV model, and look similar to one revealed in March this year. With air superiority mysteriously hanging in a balance of uncertainty, the use of hand and ground-launched smaller drones organically tied to advancing land units has fast become a defining element of the Ukraine war. Certainly NATO and other ISR assets such as satellites or ultra-long-range aerial surveillance assets have proven useful to Ukraine. Most medium-altitude drones and fixed-wing surveillance planes are likely far too vulnerable to operate in Ukraine. Homemade Ukrainian drones are carrying bombs held on with zip ties and tape. The single-use drones can't land safely once armed and launched, but they can decimate larger, more expensive targets. These makeshift aircraft have become a common part of Ukraine's reconnaissance and firepower, the New York Times reported. One drone pilot, Private Yevon, told the New York Times the drones are cheap, only costing a few $100s, compared to the $20,000 drones Russia has reportedly used. Ukrainian troops typically reconfigure civilian racing drones from the Chinese company DJI, attaching as much as 2 pounds of explosives with zip ties or tape.
A steady supply of FPV drone video clips have been shared by the SBU, the Ukraine's security service, often to somewhat inappropriate soundtracks. If there was any doubt as to what the drones do, the examples all have the telltale interference that indicates the recording was made remotely, probably to a memory card on the goggles of a typical pair of analog FPV goggles. Analog video is relatively cheap and offers very low latency, so is still well suited to the fast maneuvers of FPV remote piloting.
All the previous attacks involved the USV seen in Ukrainian government promotional videos. 6 killer USVs were employed in the latest attack on the intelligence-gathering ship Priazovye, while it was performing surveillance missions and ensuring security along the routes of the Turk Stream and Blue Stream gas pipelines in the southeastern part of the Black Sea, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, Rumad.
The military TV wrote on its website that 100,000 symbolic packs of Solidar mine salt were sold for roughly $13.56 apiece in honor of the one-year anniversary since Russia launched its invasion. Profits from the sales are being sent to the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine for the purchase of kamikaze drones. Fedorov added in his post that Rozetka, an online marketplace, and Silpo, a Ukrainian supermarket, helped cover the cost of the salt, meaning all profits could go toward financing the drones, so that all Ukrainian cities are liberated as soon as possible.
Small drones have proven extremely critical for Ukraine's war effort against a numerically larger Russian conventional force. Seeing over a ridge to detect approaching enemy armored vehicles, detecting enemy troop formations moving within condensed urban areas, or simply alerting advancing infantry and armor units with real-time video and data of upcoming terrain are all critical functions small drones continue to perform in Ukraine.
Shortly after, another tank was destroyed. Crew couldn't control the tank and sent it into a ditch. Later, the tank exploded and turned it into scrap metal. On another front segment, the Russians attacked Ukrainian positions with the assistance of 3 tanks. However, under the pressure of Ukrainian artillery, all 3 tanks were damaged. One of the tanks had its turret blown off, as is typical with Russian tanks. By the way, this is a significant difference between German tanks and Russian tanks. For instance, in this video, You can see how a Russian drone, the Lancet, hit a German Leopard tank and ignited it from the inside. However, the tank's turret wasn't blown off because all its ammunition was stored in a separate compartment. If a Russian tank catches fire with ammunition inside, it will most likely explode. We have witnessed numerous cases where Russian tanks have their turrets blown off. Another Russian tank approached close to the Ukrainian positions and was spotted by reconnaissance. With the help of a kamikaze drone, the tank was successfully ignited. The Russians tried to extinguish it but failed. They abandoned the tank and fled, while the tank burned down completely. However, to be objective, it must be acknowledged that the Russians also managed to inflict painful losses on the Ukrainian forces. For example, the Russians found and destroyed a Ukrainian Tu-S1 artillery system along with its ammunition.
And this is how it looks like at night. Naturally, it is impossible to shoot down such a shell or hide from it. Armor turns into a mesh, shrapnel easily penetrating body armor, and helmets. Check out this video. Now watch this fragment. The projectile impact has a distinctive explosion. It's the work of the HIMARS. It's unmistakable. That's how his ammunition explodes. Here's a few more examples. Two Russian Grad MLRS stand in a combat position. The Ukrainians use special shells with a lot of shrapnel. Two missiles destroy the MLRS together with the crew. And this is a Tor surface-to-air missile system. The accuracy of HIMARS is enough to hit a SAM with just one missile. The cost of such a complex is more than 10 times higher than the cost of one HIMARS missile. Over 50 large Russian ammunition depots were destroyed in 2 months. On September 10th, Mark Milley said that more than 400 large military targets had been hit with HIMARS. This is what it looked like in practice. This is a video of a hit on a Russian military convoy, and there are dozens of such examples. Here's another one, all thanks to the reconnaissance advantage and high mobility of HIMARS complexes. First, reconnaissance detects the target. Then, the coordinates are transmitted to the nearest HIMARS calculations. When everything is ready, the Ukrainians send some gifts to the Russians and burn the Russian equipment. What were the Russians counting on by moving their equipment into the open? The Ukrainians followed them, waited for the Russians to stop, and aimed missiles at them. The Russians hid their howitzer in a forest belt. That's no obstacle for HIMARS. The howitzer and the crew destroyed. Today, I'm going to show you how these systems are burning out Russian troops in Ukraine. These weapons broke all of the Russians' plans. How and why did that happen? Let's get to the bottom of it. It all started with an appeal from the Ukrainians on April 13, 2022. The US Department of Defense made a statement that deliveries of these systems would begin on June 1, 2022. On June 23rd, Ukraine confirmed receipt. On June 24th, this video appears online. It shows Ukrainians using HIMARS against Russians for the first time. On June 25th, the General Staff of Ukraine releases a promotional video about the work of HIMARS. I remember how encouraging it was to the entirety of the Ukrainian people. It was from that day that the Russians began to feel the power of American weapons. The Ukrainians started hitting all the fat targets the HIMARS missiles could reach. And Kherson? This operation was made possible by the HIMARS systems. The Ukrainians started knocking out these bridges that were supplying the Russians at the time. Blow after blow weakened the Russian troops on the right bank. Sometimes the supply of shells, food, and medicine stopped for several days. Starting from July 26th, the Antonivsky Bridge became unusable for movement. In parallel, the Ukrainians were striking at the Kakhovka Dam and Railroad Bridge. One of the Russian columns came under this kind of fire. We had to process this video in order to not shock you with this footage. Railroad service was completely stopped, and the bridge was destroyed. The Russians realized that they were trapped. On November 11th, they retreated from Kherson, blowing up the bridge. If a bridge, railroad, or highway supplying the Russian army is within range of these systems, the Ukrainians strike them. Barracks with Russian soldiers also came under fire from HIMARS missiles. The most high-profile incident occurred on December 31st, when 6 HIMARS missiles struck a camp of Russian soldiers in Makivka. According to various estimates, the Ukrainians killed about 400 terrorists that night. The building was completely destroyed. This was the site of the Russian Army's field headquarters and tents with soldiers earlier in the day. This is the explosion of one of the ammunition depots. The Russians thought they had a secure rear and were safe. Within a month, the Ukrainians destroyed dozens of large depots. And this went on for months, which weakened the Russian artillery. In this footage, a Russian soldier captures the detonation of ammunition after a HIMARS hit. Another warehouse. Here's what the warehouse looks like the day after the hit. In its place is nothing but scorched earth. All of this is the result of HIMARS' high accuracy and range advantage. At the same time, strikes were made against command posts where the 155mm Western artillery could no longer reach. Field commanders of the Russian army were gathering at this place, and good old Uncle HIMARS paid them a visit. Together with high-ranking military officers, the Ukrainians destroyed more than 20 units of various equipment. This is what a serious command center in the town of Izium looks like after the HIMARS strike. The Russian military was shocked by the firepower of the system. And such strikes have become systemic. They are still being repeated. With only 10 HIMARS installations, this has allowed the Ukrainians to launch dozens of strikes against the Russians every 24 hours. At the same time, Ukraine targeted Russian logistics. This is how the railroad stations through which the Russians were pulling equipment, fuel, ammunition, provisions, and so on to Ukraine burned. Puffs of smoke rise above the railroad station in the town of Debaltseve. And this is a photo of the hits on the railroad bridge and right-of-way at Ilovaisk. Such actions on the part of the AFU have greatly affected the fighting ability of the Russians. On August 26, 2022, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense published a post on Twitter. Usually, strike operations look like this one. The Ukrainians have detected an accumulation of soldiers and equipment in the forests of Kremena. The HIMARS pick a convenient position to hit and fire missiles. 2 tungsten-filled missiles do the job. Here's another example. A recent strike on the Russians in the Kherson region. 5 units with infantry. One HIMARS system fires 5 missiles at programmed targets. All 5 missiles hit exactly in the designated places and hit the Russian army personnel. Because of the high effectiveness of HIMARS, the Russians began to place their depots, command posts, repair bases, and other logistics further away from the front. The Ukrainians did an ingenious thing. They simply started using HIMARS for precision strikes against Russian artillery. For more than a month in the reports of the General Staff, you can see a large number of destroyed Russian artillery every day. Some of them I will show you now. 2 Russian Masta SSPHs were discovered by the AFU. Boom! The first one is destroyed, and another hit. And this is the Tornado MLRS, a rare, valuable, and deadly machine. One shot, and the Russians don't stand a chance. If you watch this video in slow motion, you can see how the HIMARS missile hits the target. This SAM wasn't so lucky either. The HIMARS fragmentation missile causes the missiles of the complex to detonate. Even concrete slabs and several floors do not save you from the impact. The shells penetrate the concrete with ease. Look what happened to this building. And if these soldiers are in the field, there is nothing stopping the Ukrainians from using ammunition with tungsten balls. Such shrapnel pierces metal. Can you imagine what it does to Russian soldiers? This SPH was stuffed with ammunition and exploded violently when hit by a rocket. No matter how much the Russians try to protect their artillery, even partially burying it, it doesn't help. A special feature of the HIMARS is its high accuracy. Now, I've got dozens of similar videos in very good quality. If you're interested in seeing a sequel, write about it down in the comments. All indications are that the Americans have already transferred GLSDB bombs to the Ukrainians. They are launched from HIMARS and fly 150 kilometers, perfect for destroying buildings. Take a look at this video. As the Ukrainians claim, this is how you use a GLSDB bomb. One question does remain. When will the US transfer ATACMS missiles to Ukraine? Such a move by the Pentagon would complicate the situation for Russia. The Ukrainians would be able to destroy logistics in Crimea and de-occupy the south. To do this, we need to cut off supplies to Crimea via the Kerch Bridge, and further destroy the bridge at Chonhar.
In the Donetsk region, the Ukrainian armed forces also shared footage that appears to show a Russian T-80 tank burning and falling to pieces after a Ukrainian military drone attacked it.
FPV drones are typically built from components by the hobby community: motors, airframes, video systems, transmitters, and the like are bought separately and assembled by enthusiasts. Now it seems some are creating production lines, and the numbers are expected to rise. Images from a widely circulated video shows what the poster called 420 of 1,000 drones, but major news agencies are now talking of the similar ad hoc building of 50,000 of these quads, each with fragmentation grenades.
Russian arms exporter Rosoboronexport even claims the BMPT can engage targets in the air, thanks to its high rate of fire and 2 separate optical sensors, one for each for the commander and gunner. The claim rings a bit hollow after Saturday. That's when the Ukrainian Special Forces Group Alpha posted a video depicting the group's explosives-laden first-person view racing drones chasing down, in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast, one of the 9 Terminators the Russian army still has left. This USV has been identified as Cat and Raccoon by the Russian Ministry of Defense, based on the Cyrillic letters printed on its left side. Pictures of the drone boat that surfaced in March were printed with the word Monobank written on the front right-hand side. This is the Ukrainian bank that collects donations from private citizens for the war effort. It is unclear if the latest USV is an entirely different model or a slight modification of the Monobank vessel.
Ukrainian intelligence noticed a convoy of trucks transporting ammunition to Russian soldiers and opened artillery fire on it. One of the trucks caught fire, causing all the ammunition inside to explode. During the counter-battery warfare, Ukrainians are destroying dozens of Russian artillery systems daily. For example, here is the self-propelled Howitzer 2S1 that was hit. Initially, the nearby ammunition caught fire, which then spread to the howitzer itself. After some time, it exploded into small pieces. The Russians have shown video footage of destroyed Ukrainian equipment, including German Leopard tanks and American Bradley armored vehicles. The Russians really did manage to destroy 2 or 3 German tanks, but that is not a significant number considering the intensity of the combat operations. In the same period of time, Ukrainian forces destroyed dozens of Russian tanks. The Russians will never show you their own losses, but we will. First and foremost, Ukrainian forces aim to destroy the most valuable types of Russian weapons that pose the greatest threats. To achieve this, they used precision-guided munitions such as Excalibur. Look at how the Russian BM-21 Grad rocket launcher was accurately hit by an Excalibur projectile. And here's another Grad that was destroyed. It is one of the most common artillery systems in Russia. It turned out that it can be easily destroyed by simply dropping a single grenade on it. The rocket launcher was damaged and started spontaneously launching projectiles. This video captured the performance of a Javelin missile. After the attack, the Russian tank retreated under the pressure of Ukrainian artillery. You can see how one tank was hit. And here, it is clearly visible how a Ukrainian soldier launched a Javelin missile from an ambush, which hit a Russian tank. Sometimes, Ukrainian soldiers succumb to excitement. The Russians abandoned an armored vehicle and disappeared. The Ukrainian armed forces soldiers decided to destroy it no matter what. Numerous grenades were dropped until finally, one grenade ignited the armored vehicle, which then burned down. There was another armored personnel carrier nearby, which was filled with ammunition. It took just one grenade to ignite that armored vehicle. The detonation of the projectiles caused the armored personnel carrier to explode. As I mentioned before, Russians easily abandon their armored vehicles as soon as they encounter the slightest threats. The thing is, Russian armored personnel carriers are highly vulnerable. They are well protected on the sides, but not from the top. Just one grenade can penetrate the hatch cover. Therefore, when Russians spot a drone carrying grenades in the sky, they immediately abandon their armored vehicles and flee. Ukrainian soldiers are left with the task of destroying them without facing any resistance. According to the Ukrainian army's data, Russia has already lost over 4,000 of such armored vehicles. Ukrainian soldiers often use such drones to target light armored vehicles as well as tanks. Look at the impeccable work of the Ukrainian artillery personnel. The reconnaissance identified the position of the Russians from where they were conducting howitzer fire. Adjacent to it was a building housing their ammunition depot. The Ukrainians launched just one projectile and hit the depot accurately, causing an immediate explosion. The blast was so powerful that it destroyed the howitzer along with the Russian artillerymen. Not far from here, the Russians positioned a self-propelled howitzer 2S5. As usual, they store ammunition right next to the howitzer among the trees. With the help of two fired projectiles, the Ukrainians hit the enemy howitzer, causing the nearby ammunition to explode. A little further behind the front lines, Ukrainians are using the HIMARS missile system to strike Russian command centers and control points. As a result of one such strike, a high-ranking Russian general, Sergei Goryachev, was eliminated. Additionally, the Ukrainians destroyed the Russian Buk M1 surface-to-air missile system with a precise hit. This system provides air cover for Russian fighters and helicopters, making it a valuable element of defense. But now, it is destroyed. Some of the Russian air defense systems refuse to operate at all. And in this video, a Russian TOS multiple rocket launcher system was spotted. The Russians used this dangerous weapon against the advancing Ukrainian infantry. With a single precision-guided projectile, the target was hit and destroyed. Also, the Excalibur projectile can destroy tanks. The Russians hid their ammunition in a road culvert, but the Ukrainians launched an FPV drone into it. The projectiles caught fire, and within a few seconds, exploded along with the culvert. The road was also damaged in the process. And here, the Russians abandoned the fuel tanker. Just one grenade lifts its contents into the air. A Russian zoo radar station was noticed nearby. With its help, the Russians were tracking the positions of the Ukrainian artillery. The Ukrainians did not hesitate to use an Excalibur projectile to destroy it with a precise hit. A Russian armored personnel carrier was rushing to aid their forces, but was hit by anti-tank weaponry. It caught fire and subsequently exploded along with the ammunition it carried. Another armored personnel carrier was destroyed by an FPV drone. It likely also carried ammunition inside. As you already know, the Ukrainian army is conducting an offensive against Russian defenses in the south of Ukraine. And although the progress is not significant yet, Ukrainian forces destroy a large number of Russian military equipment every day. One important thing I've realized about the Russian army is that they easily abandon their military equipment and flee from the battlefield when faced with significant resistance. They simply abandon their tanks in the field and run away. It's a myth that Russians fight heroically. Ukrainian forces then have to destroy all this abandoned equipment using bomber drones. If possible, the Ukrainians seize a Russian tank as a trophy and use it against the Russians. Later, another ammunition depot was found and destroyed. The Russians often hide their ammunition among the trees. Here is another example. Ukrainian intelligence found a pile of shells and dropped only one grenade on them. All Russian shells exploded and left behind a large hole. Then, only one grenade managed to destroy another ammunition depot. The explosion was so strong that it almost took down the drone.
The previous report described the success of Ukrainian forces in a series of well-executed attacks east of Robotny that pushed Russian forces out of their positions. The strategic maneuver opened the way for the capture of the village of Robotny itself. Upon studying the topographic map, it becomes clear that Ukrainians advanced through the valley, despite initially appearing to put themselves at a disadvantage by moving into the lowlands. This positioning actually set the stage for a highly advantageous next move. Troops were fighting for control of the neighboring settlement of Urozhain, she said, a Moscow-installed official in an occupied part of Ukraine's Zaporizhia region, said on Sunday that Kiev was attempting to pierce Russian lines by gaining a foothold in both villages. Hostilities are taking place in the vicinity of Urozhain, and the fight is for this particular locality, Millar said in a statement to an official military platform. There is some success on the southern and southeast axis in the vicinity of Staromorsky. Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade counted on such development of the events and was ready to push Russians non-stop. The moment the positions got cleared, Ukrainian assault units got deployed to the next one. The fighters entered Russian fortifications and steadily cleared the trenches and took captives, which is shown on the video they published on July 8th of 2023. The Ukrainians have also simultaneously capitalized on the recent gains in and around the forest to develop the second axis of advance that bypasses Klishivka and slowly set conditions for the encirclement of the main Russian fortification. Another dramatic video shows Ukrainian soldiers from the 3rd Assault Brigade launching a surprise attack on a Russian position near Bakhmut and providing medical treatment to Russian prisoners. The video depicts life on the front line and the brutal realities of close-contact warfare. The clip shows Ukrainian forces ambushing the enemy bunker at an unknown location and confronting Russian soldiers who hold up their hands and surrender. Headcam footage from a soldier identified as Datsik shows the assault of a tree line occupied by Russians by the 2nd Company of the 2nd Battalion of the brigade. Columns of Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers last tried to break into the battleground village Klishivka a month ago, and that did not end well for them either. A Russian army attack led by at least a half dozen of Kremlin's top tank T-90 breakthrough, aiming to recover tactically important terrain near the city of Bakhmut, seemed likely to have failed badly on August 14th, with Kiev forces claiming the destruction of at least a dozen Russian combat vehicles in a series of brutal artillery ambushes. Meanwhile, the morale of Russian troops on the front line is notably diminishing as Ukrainian forces conduct strikes along rear areas of the battlefield, a think tank said Sunday, 3 months into Kiev's counteroffensive. The Institute for the Study of War, ISW, a US-based think tank, said in its latest analysis of the conflict in Ukraine that Russian frontline units, particularly in the south of the country, had frequently struggled with degraded morale following Ukrainian strikes on rear areas.
The unit straps bombs onto the UAVs and drops them on Russian ground soldiers before quickly flying back, and the drone operators swiftly pack up their gear and relocate before being detected by the Russians. The secretive nighttime strike formation comprises elements from the Security Service of Ukraine, commonly known as SBU, and the country's patrol police. The report reveals the team's careful, painstakingly disciplined tactics, where hours are spent identifying targets throughout the day, with the attacks taking place at night. Phoenix Ghost drones, along with Altius 600, Jump 20, Hornet, Puma, Scan Eagle, and Penguin UAS, are just some of the small drones being delivered in large numbers to Ukrainian forces by the Pentagon. Hand and close-in launched ground drones continue to track and decimate tanks and help maneuvering urban combat units locate enemies inside of or behind buildings. Ukrainian Switchblade drones, which themselves become explosives, have been destroying large numbers of Russian tanks without having to place Ukrainian soldiers within a direct line of fire.
More than 8 million hryvnias, roughly $216,947, were raised thanks to the drawing of 5 packs of salt with the autograph of the head of the Intelligence Directorate, Kirill Budanov. Fedorov said, "Thank you to our partners and everyone who joined the gathering. Strong went together. Solidar was captured in Russia's efforts to seize its nearby neighbor, Bakhmut, which Russian President Vladimir Putin and private mercenaries Wagner Group have set its sights on for months."